episode 25. This is Fred Talks, a podcast of ideas worth sharing. Fred Talks addresses leadership, education, technology, discipleship, and ministry. Let's get started. Well, welcome to Fred Talks. This is Freddie Cardozo, your host. Thanks for joining me. I'm beginning a new series now called In Extremis, Fighting the Great Battles of Our Time. In extremis is an important word that's often used in the military, and I'll talk about it more at the end of this three-part series. But essentially the idea behind in extremis is that word is used at times of war, at times of military conflict, and in extremis means literally at the point of death. It means when a person is under duress and fighting a fight, and the intensity of that fight is so great that each and every moment of that fight, they are having to cross over the line from mere courage to bravery to heroism. So the idea of in extremis in this series is the idea that Christian believers around the world, and certainly here in the United States as well, are facing situations, facing battles that are of great challenge, that call on them for greatness, that call on them to step up and stand up and do something. And I want to talk about that in this particular series. And again, I've entitled it In Extremis as a Latin phrase, Fighting the Great Battles of Our Time. I get that from 1 Timothy 6 in the New Testament, especially verse 12. 1 Timothy is a book that's a part of the so-called pastoral epistles. The Apostle Paul, probably the greatest known Christian of all times, has written this book to this young man, Timothy, who is a new pastor or a younger pastor, and he is giving him information about how to respond to challenges there in the church at Ephesus where he is leading. And we see here that he says in verse 12, he says, fight the good fight of the faith. It's really an amazing verse, really. Fight the good fight of the faith. Meaning what? Meaning it means that there is a fight. It means the fight is a good fight, meaning it's moral, upright, even holy, if you will. And then it's a fight for the faith. And so I began to think about this very issue and say, what are fights worth fighting? What are the great causes of our time? What are the great challenges of our time? And I wanted to do this series because I believe that Christians today want to know where the battle is. What's going on in our culture? What is worthy of our attention? And what challenges are Christians and our world facing? I want to point out here that some Christians in our world believe that the only purpose of Christians or the church is to reach out with the news of Christ. And by all means, that's certainly the primary thing that Christians do. But really, when you look at the New Testament, you will see that there's two main themes that are happening. The primary thrust of the New Testament is the building of God's kingdom. What does that mean, by the way? God's kingdom is the rule and reign of Christ on the earth as it is in heaven. The kingdom of God is advancing his cause, that is, to bringing the world under his subjection through love, ironically. And to do this, to advance the kingdom, there are these two streams of ideas. One of those is saving grace. That's when, Jesus said on the most famous sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount, he said that Christians are salt and light. Well, saving grace is light. That is, that Christians expose the world to light, to the truth, that is. And then people hear the message of Christ, that he loves people, that he has given himself for people, and he wants to liberate them from their current life and where they are, and to give them, of course, eternal life. That is what we call saving grace. It's salvation, and it is to help humanity come to know Christ and cultivate a relationship with God. On the other hand, there's another type of grace, and that is common grace. Whereas saving grace is what God extends to people who believe in him, common grace is good that God gives to all people. And so God loves all people, and God extends great graces to all people, things they don't deserve. He is good to everyone. He is the Father of believers, but he is fatherly in his attitude toward all people. So common grace has to do not with being light, that's saving grace, but with Christians being salt, meaning that salt, as it has a so-called seasoning effect, or salt has a preservative effect. Like you have salt-cured hams, for example, in the South that we eat down there. And so the idea is that salt is preservative. In the same way, common grace is that Christians help preserve culture and bring light to culture and amazement to culture through good things, the good things of God, and that Christians make the world better. And so the idea behind the gospel is that Christians should be making the world a better place and extending good to it and helping humanity in the name of Christ, because God is a good God and he wants to bless all people, at the same time giving it light so that it will then look the way of Christ and see what he offers for each person. So that leads me now to the question, what are the great battles of our time? Well, I'm going to give 5 of those battles in this particular podcast, and then I'm going to do a second podcast and then do another type of battles of our time. And then I'll do a third typology in the third of the 3-part series, and then I'll wrap that up. Let's begin, though, by asking this question, what are the great battles of our time? I want to begin by saying that really there is no exhaustive or authoritative list. It's not as if you can ask one person and that then extends to every person on planet Earth. So it's a tricky question. All such lists of the great battles of our time, of the things that are challenging our world, are shaped by our own knowledge and really even our own ignorance. In other words, there's certain things that I know and that informs my thinking, and I have certainly a reasonably broad understanding of a handful of things in our culture and at large. But there's also great areas of ignorance on my part, and in those areas I simply can't speak. So there may be things of even greater importance that may be omitted. At the same time, I'm the one doing the podcast, so I get to share my ideas from my perspective, at least, about what I think's happening, though they are imperfect. Another challenge here about the great battles of our time is that identifying the challenges our world faces and challenging Christians to respond is helpful, though, because it gives us at least a starting place of where to take a stand. In other words, we're looking around to know what matters. And so when we at least call people's attention to some of the great causes, then we can focus on those. The fact is that God has issued a call of duty. God has a series of life missions for every person and wants us to be involved in his work in the world. And that work may be as a pastor, it may be as a professor like I do, it may be vocational local church ministry, it may be as a believer who ministers in a job other than a pastor. He is a banker, she is a florist, he is a cook, she is a lawyer. It doesn't really matter, it's just that God has something for all of us to do. And God wants us to be engaged in making an impact in the world for him. So I'm going to identify these challenges. Podcast 1 here will be the great global challenges of our world. The next podcast, part 2, are the great theological or ideological challenges of our world. And the third of 3 podcasts, great local church ministry challenges of our time. So let me deal with the first one, namely the great global challenges of our time. The fact is we live in a broken world. Our world is broken because of human disobedience, of rejection of God's authority, and then humanity walked away from God, and then with that came our ruin, namely that we had been given the world as we wanted it. And so we sloughed off responsibility to God, we shirked responsibility and then went our own way, as the scriptures say in Romans, and now we find ourselves with a broken world. And the challenges our world faces are great. And some of the problems we face are not directly related to theological truths, though those are important. As I said, I will talk about those later. But these simply represent issues or problems in our world that God can use all people, but certainly us as Christians, as change agents, to help address these challenges through our education, expertise, and even our spiritual gifts. So what are they? What are the great challenges of our time? The thing is that I want to share these because I feel like that Christians can easily go to secondary or tertiary issues of moderate importance, not major importance, and invest their lives in some of those things. And the thing is, like John Piper, the pastor, said, don't waste your life. It's not that only certain causes are important. There's many, many causes that are important, but some causes are greater than others. And so the thing is that I see Christians, without me calling out what those might be in my thinking, I see Christians involving themselves in things that I wonder how relatively important they are, because as you think about other issues going on in the world, you wonder, how these rank so high that it's worth a lifetime of investment. So to help point the way in this way, let me give these challenges at least something to think about. The first global challenge of our time that many people have talked about is the global water and food crisis. There remain a great percentages of people in our world that are hungry and malnourished. And malnourishment, it's important to know that malnourishment comes in two primary factors. One is not enough caloric intake and enough protein. In other words, just a lack of food. The other way is inadequate vitamins and minerals, which is another way of saying just a poor diet. The United Nations estimates that about 870 million people of the 7 billion people in the world, or 1 in 8, 1/8, were suffering from chronic undernourishment since 2012. That's the latest data that we have here in 2014. Almost all of the hungry people, 852 million of those, live in developing countries. Developing countries is a new way of saying second or so-called third world countries. And that may not be a fair designation. That's why they use the word developing. But then there are 16 million people undernourished in developed countries. And that would, of course, include like the United States and many countries in Europe, etc. So the thing is, there are hungry people. There are people with inadequate water as well around the world. It just happens that most of them happen to be in the developing world. But it isn't just food. It's also the idea of clean water. Different areas of our world are dealing with problems related to the shortage of water. Now, certainly, as you know, especially in parts of the United States, we have major problems with drought. That's certainly the case where I live here in greater Los Angeles. Where I live, I think we've had a day of a trace of rain, really something that was so small you couldn't even count it, but at least some precipitation fall, probably once in about the last seven or 8 months. Now, that is a drought. And just as we have a drought here, there's also in our world mismanagement of water and water resources. And in general, in places, the lack of clean potable water. Potable meaning ability to drink it. The world needs believers with a heart for God and skills in things like agriculture and farming and ranching and nutrition and providing clean water, people that can take a stand and do something about these problems. You see, the reason I point this out is I think a lot of believers are playing small ball. We are doing little things. We're working at a job and we are doing something that is not calling on us for greatness. And certainly not everything we do calls on us for greatness. I understand that. But the thing is that we need to be a part of the bigger solution, not just local, but also global. What can we do to make a difference? And so we should aspire to think in big ways so God can use us in big ways in order to make a difference in certain areas, certain communities, and again, even the world. So that's one of the great challenges, the global water and food crisis. Another one is the global economic crisis. And I think a lot about this, but I think a lot of times we hear about these things but don't really understand the nature of them. And I can only take a few minutes to describe it, so it's not like we'll get a full treatment of this, but at least maybe you'll understand a little bit more about it. There was a report recently of some 700 experts around the world, and they were asked, what are the great challenges of our time? Well, they listed the global economic crisis as one of their major issues. and I happen to agree. The fact is that there are enormous problems with global unemployment. There are some countries in our world that literally have unemployment that is reaching up to 50% of young people unemployed. That's a major problem. And as you have large numbers of unemployment of all types, even in the United States, we have a problem with unemployment in many of our states. But when you have massive unemployment, and at the same time, these people have energy and vitality, and they are groaning because there simply aren't jobs. And so though they are healthy and ready to work, the economy is so bad that there's simply not work. Meanwhile, when economies are bad, you often have problems with inflation and other things like that. But what happens is with so few people, that then leads to not enough workers, not enough production, lower GDP in the country. The lower GDP, the lower the economy goes, the lower its rank or rating of growth goes. With that means they have fewer taxes that they take in from their people and their citizenry in order to fund government things. As a result, that leads to national instability because, first of all, people are going hungry. They begin to get irritated. They become violent. The country is not making the money it needs. It is often overspending on top of that. People feel not listened to. They are worried about corruption. There's major issues that way. And then countries that don't have enough income cannot usually have a strong military. That's one of the first things that goes. And then when they don't have a strong military, then they are vulnerable in a national way. And when you add all that up, you also have then economic disparity. Namely that certain parts of the population are more wealthy than others. And that's especially true in developing and emerging countries, but it's also true in the United States. Now, the thing is, we all probably differ on why exactly we have an economic disparity and what to do about it. In fact, today in the United States, we have two political parties that have certain convictions about those, and I certainly have mine, and I have very strong convictions about those. So strong that, of course, we all believe we are right, and we have reasons to back it up. The main thing for me right now is not to argue why we have economic disparity or crisis, and even at this point, I don't want to deal with it in terms of trying to give solutions. I want to simply say that the problem exists. And for that reason, we have all these things going on in our countries and in countries in the world. And then those countries, though, are not islands unto themselves, but rather they are in an interrelationship between other countries and the world's financial and trade markets. And because of these things, the entire world, because our monetary systems, in some cases like Europe that has a unified monetary system under the euro, or other countries that simply share and interact back and forth with money in order to trade money and that kind of thing through trade. Well, the problem is that each major economy then could literally wreck the other. So when you looked at the EU recently, we had problems with Greece. When you looked at the EU, and we have problems with Portugal. Looked at the EU, and we have other countries with Ireland and things like that. Ireland actually is not in the EU, but they are in Europe. And the thing is that when you have these problems, you have countries that can literally pull down other countries. And for that reason, we could have literally global economic crises because of these things. And as the great economic engine of the world, America is the most important of those. And for that reason, we need a strong economy. But the thing is that there are great challenges in economics in the world. And for that reason, Christian believers need to step up. And there are Christians that have an understanding of these things and also have skills in finance and economics. There are Christians that have degrees in business, international business, microeconomics, and language skills in order to work back and forth and even could travel internationally or even live internationally. But the thing is that we need people to stand up and do something about this crisis because it is a major, major challenge. The third of the 5 great global challenges of our time that I'm going to mention in this list is the global energy crisis. You know, we hear a lot about energy today, don't we? And I think that a lot of people understand a little bit that there's a problem because we see the prices of energy going up. And we say, well, why is the price of energy going up? The price of energy in all of its various forms are going up because there is a supply that exceeds the demand. And so there's not enough energy being produced at the rate it needs to be produced in order to meet the needs. Therefore, the price of energy goes up. And as a result, people have to cut back and not use as much energy or do without. And so that is sort of the scope of the way that works. You could say, well, why isn't there enough energy? Well, that's a complicated question. But the world has a constant and exponentially growing need for energy. This energy is to supply the world's needs. And if you think about everything that needs energy in our world, right, it's not just better batteries for your cell phones. I mean, yes, they need energy. What doesn't need energy? Most things need energy. It takes energy in some form to cut down trees. It takes energy in some form to run buses. It takes energy to run cameras and to run lights, to run plants that create plastic bottles. It takes money to build energy to create batteries. And you think about all the things that use energy in our world. And because of the massive population growth in certain parts of our world, especially in areas like Africa and Asia and India, which is a part of the Asian subcontinent, what you have is enormous numbers of younger people especially. Now, Europe has a flat population growth. China has a flat population growth. There's so many people there, they have the one-child rule, as you know. Other countries that are big like China, like India, do not have those kinds of public pressures and governmental pressures not to have multiple children. As a result, India will overcome China in the world's population growth in just a few years and will become the largest population on the planet. But as you think about those countries, they are flush with younger people. And so they are Africa, Asia, like I said, and the majority of those people in those countries, in some cases up to 50%, are under the age of 21. And then in addition to this massive population growth and just the fact that they all need things that are powered, more lighting in the house, more cell phones, batteries, more things for their, more batteries for their headsets. How many batteries do you have? Think about that. More gasoline for their car, more gasoline for their motorcycle, more fuel for their propane tanks, all the things that we use energy for. And in addition to that, there is the growth of business and industry in the world. And this is massive, especially in the United States. Now, some people bust on the United States for that. The thing is that production is a great thing overall. It has some negatives, but the thing is that because of that, we help keep the world's economy going. So it's overall a good thing. And there's great discussions about that, and I would be happy to have those at some point because there's so many people that don't understand the nature of capitalism or against the nature of capitalism. But the world is having problems producing enough energy to keep up with our needs. In addition to this, we have, remember I mentioned the drought problems. Well, you say, well, what's that have to do with energy? Well, when you have drought, you have less water going through hydroelectric dams, and as a result, you have less hydroelectric power. So the lack of water actually hurts power in many areas, such as the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority system, throughout Tennessee and other areas it serves. You also then have problems because with government regulations through the EPA and the government and different parts of the government, OSHA, etc., they then throttle fossil fuel-based energy, and that's a lot of things that are traditional, like coal. Coal has essentially nearly been shut down because there's so many restrictions that coal plants can't be made. And then gas. The gas pipeline that can't be made in the different parts of the United States and Canada because of regulations the administration has placed on that. And oil, a byproduct of gas. So then that becomes a problem. So coal, gas, oil, and other things like it, natural gas. Even though we have lots of this in the ground, there's restrictions that keep us from bringing it out. And so as a result, the energy crisis becomes more acute. So now someone, of course, is saying, yeah, but at least we have green energy. Right. But the green energy solutions that have been identified have not yet reached maturity. So they're not yet viable replacements or complete solutions to the energy needs that we have. Someone could say, well, yeah, we need then to invest in those. We are investing in those. The thing is that the green energy solutions, though, are taking so much investment and so much supplemental money from the government. The question is does the government create winners and losers by providing additional money for subsidies for these companies, so the transfer of wealth to those other companies, and they choose winners and losers by giving money to them and then penalizing other types of energy. So that's why I'm under the perception that it needs to be a both and thing, that we have limited subsidies, very limited, because that's what capitalism's all about. It's about if it's a good idea, it will work. If it's a great product, it will sell. And so the thing is, all those things will come to be in the proper time. And so the system will work and it will fix itself in that way. In the meantime, we could have more energy if we didn't restrict the nature of energy that we do have. And our need for energy is only increasing. As a result, we need Christians to step in the gap here, because this is one of our great challenges. So Christians that are thoughtful, Christians that have knowledge and degrees in areas like engineering, geology, ecology, finance, microeconomics, political science, law, business, all these things to try to help find solutions in order to make the world a better place. The fourth global crisis that I would mention is the global crisis of governing. Wow. People don't sometimes realize that worldwide there are countries that are literally on the edge of revolution. Some are in revolution. Some of the world's great thinkers got together and identified challenges in government as one of the great challenges we are facing. This is because, think about this, everyone in the world is under some form of government. So everyone is under government, and lots of them are not good. And because of abuses of power, number one, because of the ineptness of government workers in some cases, they just don't know what they're doing. They're not properly vetted. They're not properly trained. They get the job because of political reasons. And I'm talking about around the world, certainly not just the United States. It's worse in other countries. But then also the corruption of government workers in some places. There's entire governments known for great corruption. And so as a result, people groan under that and don't trust their government. And it causes tremendous challenges to obedience and human obedience and civil disobedience. And then there's competing political groups and national values, and that creates challenges because you have now people that are raging against a machine back and forth because of different convictions that they have. That's certainly true in the United States with our culture battles. And then national conflicts due to the raging of people suffering under bad government. You know, people in the streets, people holding up signs, people blowing up things in the government because they're trying to get the government's attention. And the need for Christians in public service has never been greater. So if you're a Christian like that, we need you. Believers with a heart for God wanting to engage areas like law, government studies, Christians in public policy, Christians in ethics, serving those communities, public administration, social work, and political science, all these things. We need them, some of them, to stay in the United States and work here and fix this mess. But also some that are willing to somehow find ways to impact the world as well, because other governments are even more challenging shaped than our own. The last of the great 5 global challenges that I will mention, one that's very interesting to me, is the knowledge gap. Many people have not even heard of this issue, and I'm going to, I think, add with the knowledge gap what's called the so-called digital divide. The knowledge gap is very important. It immediately makes sense once you learn about it. Now, the challenge about the knowledge gap is very simple. It's that this, like many of our issues, is one that lots of people understand but disagree on how to deal with it. And I'm not going to try to deal with how to fix it today, because that then becomes eminently political. And really, my main interest is talking about the problem that exists, not necessarily how to fix it, but to fix it. So the knowledge gap is that there is a growing global gap, both in the United States and also around the world, between certain parts of the world, certain parts of nations, where nations are not producing enough people with the knowledge and skills they need to solve the many problems that we have as a human race. Now think about this. There are problems in our world. There's problems with, as I've said, energy, problems with governing, problems with economics, problems with water and food, as I've already mentioned. And there's many, many other problems with crime, problems with unwed mothers, problems with fill in the blank, all these types of issues. And these problems require solutions. Some of them are solutions from the scientific area, the so-called STEM areas, the sciences and the maths and so on and so forth. We have great problems in health, and that requires great knowledge. We have enormous challenges with things like epidemic today. We have problems with so many myriad of issues. And as we think about these challenges that we have, we need people that know information that can come up with creative solutions for our world's problems. And the thing is that our nations around the world are not producing enough people with the knowledge and skills they need to solve the problems we have. Sure, they have people, they have schools, they have educations, they have universities, but some of their quality is low. And as a result, they're graduating people with modest qualities. So some countries, they'll get out and their bachelor's degree might be the equivalent of having a high school diploma here, or maybe it might be the equivalent of having a community college education. And then maybe they get a master's, maybe that's the equivalent of having our bachelor's degree. Maybe they get a doctorate, maybe it's the equivalent of having our master's. You get the idea. And so the thing is that great access to knowledge is very important. And in addition to that, there's also access to digital resources. I'm now talking about computers, the internet. I'm talking about high-speed internet and those kinds of things. Well, the thing is, digital resources foster global learning. And there are places where schools and information is lacking, and that causes tremendous problems. And part of this is due to a lack of educational opportunities in some places. Some schools that just aren't there. Places that can't afford higher education, and so on and so forth. And some of it then is because of the knowledge gap. Some of it is caused by the digital divide. The digital divide is a problem that certain parts of the world, or certain people, even in developed countries, do not have consistent access or any access to either the electricity needed to power computers, or they don't have the computer itself, or they don't have access to the internet. And because of them, we have some in society who have this digital learning access and some who don't. And they are separated by the digital divide. And because information on the information superhighway and communication technologies, the fact that you can communicate with people around the world, are parts of education that relate and result ultimately in things like creating skills and therefore better opportunities and better jobs. And things like these reshape the global economy. That's why digital learning is causing a transfer of wealth due to just the nature of jobs. As we say often in higher education, where I work in the university, that a number of the jobs, at least 50% of the jobs, and the top 5 job fields right now in the United States, those fields are fields that were non-existent, that is, jobs that were non-existent 5 years ago when the kids went into school for college, and now they're the leading jobs. So colleges are preparing students for jobs that do not exist. And that's a great challenge. So we try instead then to train them for competencies in addition to certain types of skills they need for computers and whatever it is we're training them for. But the thing is that societies in the modern world are not equipped to keep up with these challenges. And as a result, this has led to this knowledge gap where entire countries and people groups are being left at risk because the world continues to surge forward. The world's not waiting behind. The world has to deal with these problems. And so there grows this gap between people, entire countries in some cases, and they remain developing countries or third world countries because they cannot catch up, because there's many problems in their economy and their government and all the things we talked about. They just can't focus on these things yet, and they get farther and farther behind, and they become a permanent underclass or a permanent threatened culture and society. And those very countries that sometimes become countries that are impoverished and challenged like that become the very North Koreas we face in the world, and the very Irans we face in the world, and other countries that then try to get the bomb because they want to think about how military might be an equalizing force in areas where they don't have entrepreneurialism and good education. Does that make sense? So for these reasons, We need Christians with a heart for God to help in these issues in order to close the digital divide and the global learning gap. And that will require more Christians getting involved in things like education, psychology, sociology, communications, technology, networking, digital learning, even software and hardware or computer code, that is language, programming, and so many other areas. So those are some of the great major global battles of our time. These are things that humanity is facing. These are things we all need to gather around and say, we can make a difference. So, there it is, the 5 great global challenges of our time. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like it, share it. And tune in next time when we talk about the next great challenge of our time, those being the 5 great theological or ideological challenges of our time. Thanks so much for listening. Fred Talks is a podcast produced at Studio C in Greater Los Angeles by Dr. Freddie Cardoza. Freddie is a professor, author, and leader who creates and curates dynamic content designed to equip leaders for impact and influence. For content or making contact with Freddie, visit him on the web. His website on leadership, education, and technology can be found at freddycardoza.com. His website on Christian ministry and discipleship is located at www.digitaldiscipler.com. Find this and other podcasts on the Apple iTunes Store or using any podcasting app.